Alrighty, welcome everyone, and apologies for my portañol, but bem-vindo. Welcome to today's interview in our series, Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace, with a special focus on Brazil, with the esteemed historian of the Goiás region, Dr. Mary Karasch. Please stay tuned at the end of the program today for information on our next presentation on Brazil, next Friday, April 30th. I am Catherine Tracy Good, Tracy to my friends and colleagues, the director of the Tools for Researchers program at the Americas Research Network, or ARENET, and I'm really happy that you've been able to join us for this interview today. In late 2019, one of ARENET's biggest projects came to fruition when the Oxford Handbook of Borderlands of the Iberian World was published. The volume is a state of the field on borderlands and frontiers across the Spanish and Portuguese colonial worlds, from North and South America to Asia, with 34 essays and 40 authors. The volume is available for purchase. For those of you at universities, don't forget to ask your libraries to purchase a copy, and as a digital resource through the Oxford Handbook online via an institutional subscription, or you can purchase individual chapters. Today, we are honored to have the opportunity to interview Mary Karasch about her chapter in the volume, Riverine Borderlands and Multicultural Contexts in Central Brazil, 1775 to 1835. But before we get started, just a few words on logistics. After the conversation, we will open the floor for questions from the audience to participate in the Q&A. Please send a message via the chat function, usually at the bottom of the screen, but sometimes it's also at the top of the screen. So I'll just to warn you about how to find the chat function. But please either write your question in the chat function or just a note to us that you would like to ask a question of Dr. Karasch. We will put you in the virtual queue, and when it is your turn, we will unmute you individually so you can ask your question directly. You can ask your questions in English or Spanish, and today, Dr. Karasch is happy to receive questions in Portuguese as well. Also, please be advised that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to ARENET's various platforms. If you prefer not to be recorded but would like to ask a question, I will be happy to read it for you from the chat. Now, let me introduce you to Dr. Karasch. Mary Karasch received her doctorate from the University of Wisconsin and is professor of history emerita at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, where she taught until 2010. She also taught at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., the Universidade de Brasília, and the Universidade Federal de Goiás. Her principal publication is Slave Life in Rio de Janeiro, 1808 to 1850, which was also published in Portuguese and won the prestigious Albert J. Beveridge Award from the American Historical Association. Her most recent book, published in 2016, Before Brasília, Frontier Life in Central Brazil, traces the social evolution of the states of Goiás and Tocantins from a colonial society characterized by enslavement and conquest to one integrated by a predominantly free population of color, along with autonomous indigenous nations. Her article that we are discussing today is based on this research. She has also published a long list of articles, encyclopedia entries, and was co-editor of the 1996 5-volume set, The Encyclopedia of Latin American History. And now, welcome, Mary. We can get started with our interview. Okay.
Okay, would you like me to begin now?
Okay, I'm going to put this is our first slide, and I'm going to start with our first question. Your chapter lays out the history of what came to be called the Captaincy of Goiás, a mountainous region cut through by significant rivers. You argue that the environment defines the history of the region, from mountain ranges creating borders and rivers that traversed them. How does the natural environment determine the movements of the diverse populations that lived in the region or attempted to lay claim to it?
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about research that I've conducted literally for decades, because I was fortunate to live in the region and teach at the University of Brasilia, which you can see on the map. And that is kind of, I gave the title to the book to help people who have never been to Brazil, to localize the region. So henceforth, Before Brasilia. So when I taught there, I went exploring, and I found all the way to the west the city of Goiás. In the 18th century, it was Vila de Goiás, and that was the captaincy of this enormous countryside region. The thing or one of the many things that has impressed me about the region is simply the extraordinary size of it. And when I went to the local archive, the Museo das Banderas, I then localized documents on enslaved Africans that I'd never been able to find in Rio, for slave life in Rio. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to do my next research project on this region. In other words, when I first went to Rio in 1968, everybody told me I'd find nothing, that there were no documents. But eventually I was able, to localize the documents on which I wrote the book. Mm-hmm. So in this case, I found the documents first, and then worked out this research project, which initially I thought would take only a couple of years, but it did not. So anyway, getting back to the question, I think one of the most important things to understand about this region is the cycle of dry season, rainy season. For those of you who have had a chance to live in an area, dominated by two major seasons, the drought time and then the torrential rain time. I've been watching a program on the monsoons in India and the impact in northern India. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. In the dry season, and one of the things I've been able to document, usually through governor's reports, who were rather amazed at how dry it became. And, everything then began to move in the sense that this was the time of war. This was the time for the great expeditions, the Banjeras from Sao Paulo, because they could move in the dry season. When I traveled with an anthropologist, James Dow, we drove through the rivers because they were all dried up. And then, of course, you get the dust. And anyone who has lived in Arizona, like I now live, deals with dust, especially at the end of a period of drought. So this is also, and it was in the past, as it is today, the season of the burnings. In other words, clearing the fields, burning off everything, and so smoke everywhere. Mm. Now, the Banjeras learned at the end of the dry season that they could locate Kayapo villages, and Kayapo do Sul, way in the south, mm-hmm. By the burnings. So they followed the smoke, basically, and then they attacked the village. So this is the period of war. At the end of it, it's the period of the dust and the burnings. And then we get to the time of the waters. Mm-hmm. And the expression from the period that I especially like, they referred to in the time of the waters, because this is what happened. For 6 months, it rained every single day, and more intensely in the north than in the south. Mm-hmm. And sheets of rain, torrential rains. So if you've ever been in an area of torrential rainfall, you can get a sense of what they were experiencing. All right, so in the rainy season, a lot of things simply had to stop. But then we even find the Kayapo, for example, taking advantage of the rainfall, because they would attack often isolated farms, because they knew that the horsemen, couldn't follow them in the muddy areas. Mm-hmm. So there was some warfare, in the rainy season. But a lot of the peoples just had to retreat and stay put until the heavy rains ended. So one of the reasons why, obviously, we have so many rivers is because of the rainfall. And if you turn to the maps in the chapter, you can follow, we'll start first of all with the Tocantins River. And on maps like this, we have no sense at all of the length of the river. And I'd say one of the spectacular flights to take in Brazil is to board in Brasilia and then head north to Palmas, the capital of the state of Tocantins, because you descend the Great Plateau of central Brazil, and you can see the descent, and then you follow the river, but for what seems like hours, and you only get to Palmas. You're not even, at way north of the river. So the Tocantins River is over 1,600 miles in length. It's the second longest river after the Amazon. So we have an extraordinary river to get people from this region all the way up to the mouth of the Amazon River. But there was one very rocky in places, with falls, rapids, and this was often the point at which indigenous populations would hide and attack travelers. So it made it difficult for the outsiders to descend the Tocantins. So the Tocantins was the principal Luso-Brazilian river. Now the Araguaia, and on the map you can see where it says Araiz and Karasch, and then up to Javae on Bananal Island. All right, so the Araguaia, rising in central Brazil again. Now, way over here with the arrow. Okay, yeah, there we go. Up to join the Tocantins. All right, now the Ottawa River, until peace was made in 1775 with the Portuguese, was controlled by the Karasch. And the Karasch commonly traded up the river all the way to the mouth of the Amazon. And then after the Portuguese established themselves in Belém, they traded directly with the Portuguese there. But we also know the other side, when the Jesuits launched expeditions down the Araguaia, these were the people who fought off the Jesuits. So they have this dual image, of both people trading, but also then protecting their control of the Great River. So on one side, Tocantins, fully in contact with the Luso-Brazilians, the Araguaia, pretty isolated until 1775. And then the third geographical characteristic that is so essential, I believe, is the role of the mountains. Because the rivers are flowing through often mountainous areas. And we're going to see just some views both with the Tocantins River, but also with the capital of Lisboa. Now, as far as I could determine, there were not many indigenous mountain dwellers, traditionally, as you think of in other parts of Latin America. And I think it's because the rivers were much more attractive places to live because they provide the water, areas for their crops to be raised on the banks of the river, and the mountains often didn't offer either water or food possibilities. But we have a people who were pushed to the mountains, and these were the Avacanero. As you can see, about the center area. Now, one of the most interesting, I'd say, people of this region were the Abacanuero. They were the most resistant to Luso-Brazilian invasions, and they fought continuously. This is one of those groups that did not make peace with the Portuguese, did not enter missions, although there's some fragmentary evidence that they had once had contact with missionaries because they could curse the Portuguese in Portuguese. And also, when in battle or attacked, they would often use curse words and ugly words directed at the Portuguese. Mm-hmm. So there's some evidence of some Christianization, maybe in the far past, but one of their overall reasons for fighting to avoid enslavement. Okay, so in other words, this will give you some sense of the geography of the region that we're talking about. Okay, let's turn next to the Tocantins River. Okay. All right, now this is a beautiful romantic image of the river. It is not quite right because I've seen the real, what they call in Portuguese, chapada or mesa. But what the artist is trying to do is to convey to you the background of an absolutely gorgeous area of the region. These mesas, unlike the ones in Arizona, are covered in green foliage. And the area of southern Maranhão, as you approach the Tocantins River, is gorgeous. Even today, before so much devastation has taken place, you can get a sense of what it must have been like in the past. Now, the Tocantins River is often a very narrow river, and I think this is one of the things important in terms of understanding a lot of the conflicts going on in the region. This picture suggests it's much wider. This is more like the Araguaia River in width. You can easily cross it, and this was very important for many indigenous populations like the Xavante, who did not go by canoe on the rivers, but they would build rafts and they would quickly swim across the river and then attack local miners and settlers and raid for food crops and then go right back across the river. Here you see the typical riverboat and a smaller canoe and the expedition preparing to cross the river. So in other words, this is not like the Amazon where you've got such broad expanses of water, but it could serve for the flow of populations, both indigenous and native. Okay, next.
Okay.
All right, now this is the second slide, sort of suggesting, how the mountains dominate in Goiás, and this is Vila Boa de Goiás, 1803. This was the building here where you get the both the quarters of the city council, and then in the bottom, the jail. And it is now the Museo das Banderas in the city of Goiás. And the other notable feature of the city, you'll see here the wall. This is the only walled city I have seen in Brazil. And there's a good reason for the walls. It was because the city was frequently attacked by the Kayako. In the discourse of the Portuguese governors, one theme always comes across, and that is of the indigenous populations being nomadic, hunters and gatherers, wild people, uncivilized, all the negative stereotypes you can possibly imagine. Mm-hmm. But when you find the records of the people who actually met them, went to their villages, and you find a completely different situation. The population of Villaboa and the largest village of the Kayapo, about the same number of people, about 4,000. Mm-hmm. This is not a situation where you've got small bands of 50 people. Of course, some of those did exist in the captaincy, but I would say, at least in population, more equally balanced. Mm-hmm. Okay, shall we move on then to your Indigenous question?
Yes. You talk about the many nations that lived in this region and the ones that survived as you say, the onslaught of Banjeras, epidemic, disease, and enslavement. You talk specifically in your article about 7 nations that persisted. What defined the intertribal conflict and/or cooperation before the arrival of the invaders?
I would like to know that for the period before the 1590s, mm-hmm. but our evidence is very fragmentary. Mm-hmm. And then when we get to the 1590s, then we get the reports of the Bandera leaders, of the people that they encountered, mm-hmm. The descriptions. Okay, there's one of the things that's going on in terms of the reports of the Bandera leaders. Their objective was to get a habit of Christ recognition from the Portuguese crown, and they had to justify their conquests, explain what they had done. And then once we reach that point, then we get more information that we can draw from the stories of the conquerors. But the bias always there is they're out to prove that what they did was wonderful, meritorious, etc. But here and there we can get a hint of what was going on. I should also add, sometimes we get a sense, like with the Karasch, that they were not a large people. And there's one crucial document from 1775 that I found the original of at the Biblioteca da Ajuda in Lisbon, that lists all of the Karasch villages. That was deleted from any of the published materials on the alleged conquest of the Karasch. So if the official document would say, give you the sense that there's only these 2 villages. But when you look at the complete record by the Bandera leader, then you get a sense of how many there actually were. Okay, so from these fragmentary records then, it's very clear one of the big conflicts was over the control of a river, mm-hmm. the banks of a river, because the banks would be crucial for producing corn. And after sugar was introduced to the region, we even find the Xavante, for example, raising sugar for themselves. So they're adopting, some foods from the settlers. Then another critical problem for many of the people was either the end of the dry season, when food was in short supply, or the rainy season, when the floods were so bad they could not, get many food crops. And so we're going to get raids, attacks on the people who have the food and the water. And of course, as the Luso-Brazilians move in, then we get the attacks on the mule teams transporting food and water. Mm-hmm. So that's, again, a very common motivation. Now, another factor that seems to have been very common invading and capturing women and taking them back to their villages. Now, all of the groups did that, but not the Canuero. The Canuero were infamous for killing both women and children. So you don't get incorporation, within their communities and villages. But in general, we've got a lot of conflict over the kidnapping and enslavement of women. And then, of course, if the Shavanti raided for Karasch women, then the Karasch would attack the Shavanti, and so forth. The constant cycle connected with the capture of women. Another reason, internal political divisions. The most famous one is the split of the Shavanti and the Charente. The Shavanti had conquered, incorporated the Charente within them. So they had come to form one group. Mm-hmm. The anthropologist Nimo Ndaju saw them as totally similar in culture and language. And so they had lived together until the early 19th century. And then sometime by the 1840s, they had split into two separate peoples. The Shavanti now live west. They moved to Mato Grosso and then to the Xingu National Park. And the Charente now live in the north of the state of Tocantins. So, quite often it's internal political divisions that could even lead to splits. Mm-hmm. And then just a final one before we move on, the vengeance motive. This is especially true of the Kayapo. We see it in the 19th century when, say, a group of local miners and ranchers would get a small Banjeras together. They'd attack a Kayapo village and perhaps kill 5 people and take the others as slaves. So then the Kayapo would retaliate, and they would kill 5 people. So we often get that tit for tat going on. But vengeance, as the anthropologist Odair Giraldin has documented a clear motivation for intertribal conflicts. Mm-hmm. All right, now the other part of the question concerns cooperation, alliances. And one of the, I think, really fascinating examples that comes from the conquest of the Karasch is that we see the Javae, who now live on the Iria de Bananao, meet the Karasch, and then they form a circle and dance together. Mm-hmm. Dancing, often a very important part of interethnic relations. And even when we get the description with the Charente meeting Luso-Brazilians and establishing a mission, something that was critical was dancing. But the head of the expedition, representing the authorities in Puerto Nacional, he refused to dance, but everybody who was with him danced with the Charente. Mm-hmm. So in other words, the dance, and I wish I had more evidence on that. Okay, now with an individual you're going to see later, this Charente captain, Francisco Suarte. It was he.
We go forward to the slide?
No, not yet. Because I think I've got that slide further on down.
Okay.
Okay, but I just want to mention it here. In Portuguese discourse, there's always the sense that it's they who want to make peace and the people don't want to make peace, the indigenous people. But Captain Francisco Suarte was the one who traveled south on the Tocantins to Puerto Nacional to begin the peace process. Mm-hmm. They actually succeeded in making peace. So again, you do see this pattern of peacemaking on this frontier, and it's often, we see it within indigenous groups, but also even with reference to the Luso-Brazilians.
Excellent.
Okay, let's move on then.
I think we'll skip ahead a little bit. So I'd like to talk about the Banjeras and the missions.
Yes, just where I was going.
Excellent. So the Luso-Brazilians claimed control as invaders over central Brazil through Banjeras, largely to acquire gold and the establishment of missions like the Jesuits on the Tocantins River. In practice, their control of the region was continually contested, often violently. How did they manage to maintain a presence, both the Banjeras and the missions in Goiás, despite the resistance of indigenous nations and African descended communities, or the quilombos?
Okay, I will try that as soon as I can, or as quickly as I can, because I can see we're eating up time. In looking at Banjeras, I went back to the Africanist Joseph Miller on the slaving frontier. Now, he was talking about the slaving frontier in Angola, but you begin to see such similarities. And sometimes the same people who had served in Angola are also serving out on this frontier. So Goiás was initially a slaving frontier. The wealth of the region, indigenous captives, and that's what the Banjeras were looking for. But they were also looking for gold, because on their expeditions into the interior, they picked up these traditions about gold, such as the Arayes women who wore pendants and necklaces of gold. And so gold, the fever for gold, is also driving a lot of these banderas. And the bandera is like a highly mobile, small army with indigenous auxiliaries and captives, indigenous captives initially, but they also bring in enslaved Africans. It's a very multi-ethnic group of people who are out there doing the enslaving. And I think this is one of the important things to understand about the region. It's not just the era of the great banderas. They discover gold in Vila Boa in 1720, and thereafter 1740s up in the north in Tocantins, and it's one discovery after another of gold. And of course, that just brings in more banderas. But the bandera tradition is replicated elsewhere, in the captaincy and continuously, because towns like Vila Boa would not wait for the Portuguese to commission a bandera. From Lisbon, they would form their own and go out and seek indigenous captives, and also move against quilombos of Africans, fugitive Africans, to bring slaves to the towns and the cities. All right, so that's one key component. How could they continue? It's because the bandera tradition continues. And they're very mobile and very able, often in their conquests, but not all. All right, now the other factor, the missions, the church, begins with the Jesuit entradas, moving down from Belém in the north, and they established themselves particularly in what is now the state of Tocantins, and again in the south of the captaincy too. The Jesuits bring, the church to the region, and we should be moving now to the mission of São José de Osometes, which is about 9 on the list.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay. So this The Jesuits were based here until their expulsion in 1759. And so this is the mission when it was in decadence by the early 19th century, 1803, 1804. The Kayapo did not live in the mission. The barracks were largely populated by mulattoes and blacks. And this was the largest and most important of the missions. Now, at the mission, Portuguese based the pedestres. These were the indigenous soldiers who protected the mission. Now, we have the Spanish image of, you think of the frontier here in Arizona, where there would be people from Mexico who would come up and guard the missions. But here we have the Kayapo guarding the Kayapo. The director of the mission at the end of its period was a Kayapo rather than a Portuguese appointee. The church, very small at the time that this drawing was made. All right, now the other characteristic of this mission, of this area, was the establishment of the popular church of Goiás and Tocantins. Now, I use the term popular church because there were very few priests that served in Goiás. The Jesuits were expelled in 1759, and in so many cases they weren't replaced. And we moved then to a pattern of documentation in which indigenous communities who had been based at a mission appealed to the Portuguese for a priest. So there's a long period until the 1840s in which we don't have a missionary presence. And of course, for the historian, that means a long period without the documentation that we need. Okay, now at these churches then, and I think you may have to back up one for the King of Congo. I'm using this as a contemporary slide I took in the 1980s of a congada in the city of Goiás. We ask, how did they succeed? How did the Portuguese succeed? It's because of the presence of the enslaved Africans as slaves first. It is in many cases the Africans coming from areas like Ghana, where gold mining was well known, are the ones who find new mines. And the Portuguese even gave them reward. If they found a mine, they would be freed. So we also have the pattern of many blacks securing their freedom. One set of documents I'm working on now are the slave sales of the early 19th century. And, it's a record of all the people who are being bought and sold, male, female, children, the elderly. See a lot of elderly Africans being sold because they were probably brought in, at the height of the gold mines. So the Africans are absolutely essential in mining. And even afterwards then, we get their importance in mining. Even all the way to the present. I actually visited a gold mine where all the workers were black, and they came from a nearby black community. So this is the group that is generating the wealth of the region.
And I'm just going to back up to this is one of the popular churches?
Yes, this is the Church of Rosario. This is of the Black Brotherhood. So in other words, we've got individuals with access to gold, men and women. And they form a lay brotherhood, which was responsible for the construction of this church. Now, I know the Jesuits worked among this black community. So in Natividade, we have a powerful cultural center of the black church. We also have the black militias. Now, when I came to the records, I was thinking in terms of our own Western history, Arizona history that I knew. And, I was thinking, okay, it's white soldiers, Spanish soldiers, maybe mestizo mulatto soldiers fighting the indigenous population. But in this area, it's the racially mixed, the pardos, but also the blacks. And why they were raiding quilombos, why they were fighting, was because they were so often the targets of the indigenous communities. So they were defending their own towns and villages. Okay, so we get, another reason, why the Portuguese survived in the region is the strength of the creation of these new communities of free people of color and the descendants of the enslaved Africans. By the end of the period, we basically have a largely free population of color, the descendants, and slavery has clearly eroded in the region.
That transformation is fascinating. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I thought to talk about the issue of warfare, because this is such an important part of the article. And as you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation as well, that the period that you look at in the article especially is really marked by warfare. How did Indigenous nations and Africans or peoples of African descent defend and negotiate their positions within the structures of the Portuguese Empire? And again, we return to the rivers, as you argue, quote, one of the more significant characteristics of warfare in central Brazil was the use of the rivers in fighting one's enemies or raiding for goods, end quote. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about riverine warfare.
Okay. Well, for all of us who have, looked at patterns of warfare cross-culturally, good, we have the Karasch warrior, the Apinage. We're interested in the theme of, when did firearms come into an area? When did people make the transition to the use of firearms? All right, now this has been really hard to document. It's also been hard to even get images of what was one of the most effective weapons, this huge, long staff. That was a brutal weapon in warfare, especially in hand-to-hand combat. Now, with the Apinage, note we have an illustration of the bow and the arrow. And I think this is one of the symbols, I would say, of indigenous warfare in this region. The bows and the arrows were used in ambushes, at the falls of the Tocantins River. And the one description that I had included was of the attack in 1774, recorded by Tavares Lisboa. So it's very clear that, this was a very effective weapon. But again, of course, Tavares Lisboa did have a European, and I even hesitate to say anything other than a firearm because I don't quite know which European rifles were in the region in the 18th century. I do know there were muskets, and the muskets often didn't fire very well, especially under wet conditions. And the arquebus, if I'm remembering correctly, another weapon that didn't fire, very well. But the archers were extremely effective in the massive use, massing regiments firing the weapons. And they were often quite deadly in the initial attack on the rivers. The Jesuits, too, recorded the effectiveness of the archers as they tried to descend the Araguaia River. Okay, so we've got those two kinds of weapons. So one of the problems I faced was just identifying the weaponry. What were they fighting with? What did the Portuguese and the Luso-Brazilians actually have in terms of using firearms? Now, the other weapon that we get frequent references to is an artillery piece. But I don't have a picture. I mean, artillery pieces come in many designs and styles, etc. But the Luso-Brazilians would use them, an artillery piece, to bombard a village. And they were often quite effective at that. Now, one weapon that the people developed, the indigenous peoples developed, was that of fire. We get a particularly dramatic story from the Charente, in which they set fire to bamboo as mounted men were chasing them, going after them. And of course, the fire just terrorized both the men and the horses, and so they were stopped. So fire, it was also used against their enemies, indigenous enemies as well. And in attacks on villages, they often used their arrows to send shafts of fire to set the village on fire. Now, another thing before I leave the theme of the bow and the arrow, many, if not most, other than the Canuero, used women in combat. But what the women did in combat is that they they had a sheaf of arrows on the back of the individual, and they would draw the arrow out to give it to their husband, and then he would shoot it off. Mm-hmm. So this was how they got the arrows so quickly. Canuero women, however, actually went into combat. And of course, the Portuguese observers always commented on the women who fought so bravely, sometimes more bravely than their men. So this was the only group, as far as I could tell, that actually had women fighting alongside. And I think it's because the position of the Canuero was so desperate, even in the early 19th century, because they were being pushed by Banjeras constantly. And so even the women had to fight to defend a village. Now, another extraordinary use was that of Africans. The Charente even asked Africans to come and join them in living in their villages. They would give them freedom, and they would give them a wife. But not many took them up on that. We just have a few, about 10 or so actually did that. But in other cases, Africans ran away to the indigenous villages. And then if they had been warriors in Africa before capture and sale to Brazil, they also added their expertise. Mm-hmm. And we know that the Canuero often fought with fugitive Africans because there were many quilombos, communities of fugitive slaves, near their territory. So we get an outside group providing expertise, but from the African side. Okay, now I could go on with many other attacks and so forth. But I do want to, and we may have to close with this, is note that we definitely had structures for negotiation within the Luso-Brazilian imperial system. Mm-hmm. One goal of the Portuguese crown was to incorporate these peoples into a situation of becoming vassals. And this process of vassalage was one of the ways in which they attempted to sell a position, to negotiate a position within the Portuguese imperial system. Now, if a group agreed to it, as the Karasch did in 1775, then they would be they would have a presidio established on their lands and a mission. But that didn't last very long because they were mistreated at the presidio and they didn't get the missionaries at the mission. And so that whole system broke down. But that was the goal, was to pacify them from the Portuguese viewpoint, settle them in missions, create this group of armed men who would fight for the Luso-Brazilians as opposed to themselves. So we have alliances that are made and unmade constantly with the Luso-Brazilians, and the sides change all the time. Now, one of the most interesting manipulations of the Portuguese system came from 5 nations who declared themselves to be the United Indian Nations. Now, this is early 19th century. They appealed to the crown for demarcation of their lands. It took a long time, and it was finally given to them in 1822. And one of the justifications had been that they had fought with the Portuguese to expel the Dutch in the 17th century. So they had this long memory, and they were able to convince the crown, and they got the demarcation. But don't forget, 1822 was also the date of the independence of Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if they ever really kept this.
Right.
But again, it's a reflection of what they could accomplish. Now, I know you also wanted me to deal with some conclusions, but I can tell by my watch I've gone way over time.
No worries at all. No, I think we'll let, I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and let folks ask their questions. And we have one from Cynthia Radding, who's the editor of the volume. Let me see. Are you there, Cynthia?
Yes, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary, so much for this very interesting presentation. And I don't want to take a lot of time because I want other people to ask questions too. But it occurred to me as you were talking about weapons, and it was something that I was wrestling with in something I was writing recently, but having to do with boats and navigation. Technology is a big part of history, and particularly the kind of history that we do and the history in the borderlands. And you were saying your difficulty of finding different kinds of weapons. And I was wondering if you wanted to reflect a little bit on how we historians can find technology, or what ways we look for it in the archives.
Well, I often find that we don't find it in the archives, but we may find it in illustrations if we were fortunate enough to have artists who visited and recorded, the weaponry, or anthropologists. This region owes an extraordinary debt to Kurt Nimuandajo, because, even if you come across a document that describes something or names something, he, at least in his published materials, will show you what it looked like. So anthropologists, I think, are often absolutely crucial to trying to determine that. Or with boats, there are very few visual images of the boats of the 18th century, or even the early 19th century. But we had an English botanist who went to the region, man by the Burchell, and fortunately he was able to draw, and he drew some pictures of boats. And with the painting that I just showed you, we get, one type of boat, and we may get a description of, a long canoe, and then there's going to be a mat on the back end that will protect the cargo. But it's very fragmentary normally.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Hal Langford. Okay, floor is yours, Hal.
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks for helping this happen together today, bringing us together. Mary, it's so wonderful to see you.
Likewise.
And yet, a little box on my laptop. Mary, I have a question that I guess sits at the intersection of Goiás's political history and its indigenous history. You've already talked about some of the boundaries or borderlands established. I mean, one of the wonderful aspects of this chapter is the notion of riverine borderlands and the way in which we can work rivers into our understanding of borderlands. But those are natural borderlands and they don't necessarily perfectly coincide with Goyas's political borders. And we know that indigenous peoples frequently crossed those borders. They were not necessarily meaningful to Native peoples. So I'm wondering if you've thought about and what you can help us understand about the connection between Goyas's boundaries, its political borders, and indigenous spatialities or territoriality.
Okay, I think one way to answer this question is no one knew what the boundaries were of the captaincy of Goyas in the 18th century and even into the 19th century. Because in the north, part of the captaincy was in Maranhão, what is now Maranhão. But Tocantins lost that, to Maranhão. So it became part of Maranhão. In the far south, the Triângulo Mineiro was once governed. So a lot of the documentation from that region is actually in the city of Goiás, in the Museu das Bandeiras, rather than in the museum or the archives in Minas Gerais. So that part. Then Mato Grosso and Mato Grosso do Sul used to be parts of it used to be part of the captaincy. So the Portuguese themselves didn't even know where the so-called legal boundaries were of the captaincy. And of course, the indigenous populations just, lived in their time period dealing with banderas that came from all directions. It wasn't just from Sao Paulo, but from Mato Grosso, Minas Gerais, and so forth.
May I follow up?
Of course.
So as you know, Mary, I work on the neighboring captaincy, and I find that absence of specificity with respect to the political boundary of the captaincy often coincides with the presence of unconquered, unincorporated, independent Native people.
Exactly.
And does that make sense? Do you find that makes sense in terms of Goiás as well?
That's very true, because the other group that's influenced by this lack of firm boundaries are the Quilombos. There was a huge Quilombo led by what's his name, Antonio, and because the Quilombo was so far, both from the city of Goiás and then also from the official forces of Minas Gerais, had flourished for years, decades, literally. And I think, again, these disputed boundary areas were very helpful to many indigenous communities.
Okay, I think that's our last question for the day. I want to share my screen again for the conclusion here. Sorry we didn't get to all of our slides today, but I wanted to give a massive thank you to Dr. Karasch for joining us today. It's such an interesting presentation, and it's a great article. I highly recommend reading the article from our volume. And I'd also like to thank my co-host of this series, Greta de Leon, who is the executive director of ARENET. She's been managing things behind the scenes. And of course, especially to all of you in the audience for joining us today. We hope to see you again next week, Friday, April 30th, 2021, of course, from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the next presentation on Brazil in the Iberian Borderlands and Cyberspace series with our homenagem a John Monteiro. Look for the link to register in our social media post, to register via Zoom so that you can attend the presentation. And please help us spread the word to honor the life and work of this important scholar of Indigenous Brazil. And thank you all again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next week.